Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. And thank you very much, Corinne, for your commitment and for bringing all these wonderful people together here in Salzburg. We want to spend the next 25 minutes speaking about the world trade system and a transition of the system. And this is very topical. We're faced with a situation where we see that there seem to be positive sum games, and this doesn't seem to be the case anymore, the zero sum game. And we can see we have to win a prize or divide up the pie or whatever. There'll be a lot of losers, but not the conventional way as we had in the past, where many different countries could have and benefit from the world trade system at the same time. Let's begin with a couple of figures. What we can say is that the hyperglobalization phase is over. I think that is something that you can see here. If you look at the last 50 years from 1925 to 2003 or 24 and 1975, from 1990 to 2008, we had this green episode, the green highlight, where you can see globalization moved on very quickly. And this is measured with regard to dividing up the world trade divided by world production. If this goes up, then world trade is growing faster than world production. And this was the case in the 70s until early 90s. That wasn't really the case. So some ups and downs. And then we had this phase where world trade overall in less than 20 years increased. It grew 40% faster. So this is a huge phase of globalization. And then you can see a change. You can see the blue and the red trade in goods and services, and you can see that things have slowed down. Another thing you can see is that it continues to be volatile, not necessarily upwards or downwards. If you're looking for trends, then you will see a certain trend for deglobalization, but volatility is there. And it's also quite exciting to see that the trade in services has much more momentum. But we see this episode here. It wasn't a very long one. It was about 20 years ago. And if you think back with really nostalgia, so to speak, when globalization took place very quickly, but this was a relatively short period of time. It was an anomaly in history, so to speak. Now, when we talk about research, we can ask about what is driving all this openness, the globalization. What drives trade? Well, first of all, these are artifacts to a certain extent. 30 years ago, between Prague and Bratislava, this was not really trade statistics, but now these are two different countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So now we have more trade. That's not what we mean by globalization. These figures would have to be eliminated. And Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, these are countries that broke apart. What's important here is that when we see the company growing, when supply is more than demand, then of course you can see there is more trade. So this is what our models all predict. And they basically say that if the GDP of the world or the countries grows by 1%, then world trade should also grow by about 1%. That is to say, ceteris paribus, if nothing else happens, that's what the case should be. It's when countries come closer together. China, 50 years ago, 2 to 3% of the world GDP, then all of a sudden they start catching up, they grow, and they're interesting as a trade partner, then the sum goes up when it comes to the trade in the world. So it is more equally distributed amongst the landscape, and we can see that this drives trade up. Another interesting point is, and politically it's interesting as well, what about trade policy? What kind of an influence does it have? There are customs, of course. That's quite obvious. We see what is being trained. If Trump threatened the Europeans, then we saw the customs on cars. But we see regulatorily speaking, for example, these would play a more important role for the changes in world trade. And one very important point here, there's a lot of research on this that's very clearly showing us that it's not only the amount of the tariffs or customs or the regulatory agrees, it's also the uncertainty, if you don't know what you're going to have to pay in terms of customs in the United States if you produce cars, then of course you don't know what kind of investments will be necessary or the dealer network, etc. So this is all very uncertain. So this investment becomes less industry and you do something else. So you see there's a lot of research on all of this. So the question is, how can policies deal with uncertainty? That's an important point. We also have a lot of literature on trade, as I explained to you on the chain a minute ago, and other types of or forms of globalization, the mobility of capital across the borders or mobility of people across the borders, knowledge, and clearly the empiric research says that these are complementary. If you see the movement of people, if this is banned, then of course this will affect trade as well. And then you can see that in other circumstances, you will see people moving freely, then of course this will also drive the flow of trade. This all fits together. In red, this is important empirically speaking. These are the things that are very important to us, and that is technological progress. That's important for the amount of trade with regard to GDP. The steam ships in the early 20th century, the railroads, and then the containerization or the information technology. Studies have tried to compare these different drivers of trade, and what they say is the following. In a long trend, it's the technological changes that drive openness, and within these, in red, you can see political cycles. That's where they are found. We had periods where customs were reduced, and then it goes back to the 19th century, and then there was a globalization backlash, which I'll come back to in just a minute. And I think right now we're in a situation where, in particular, political uncertainty is very strong, and that is a brake on trade. But then we see the technological progress, and this is something that we cannot ignore. Now, if you take a look, it's the same figure I showed you before. I've changed it around a little bit, and I've changed the solid lines to dotted lines so you can see it more clearly. This is an index of the openness of the world from a legal point of view. My apologies to all the legal experts. There are colleagues who try to define de jure the openness of the word, what will facilitate trade and movement of capital. This is an index for this, and what we can see, and we can see the de jure index of openness. This is a change in the openness, which we can see on the market, and this seems to correlate. This is also a warning. You shouldn't read too much into correlations. Maybe countries have become more open because they can afford to be so. But of course, this is at least an indication of the fact that there might be something behind all of that. There are all sorts of studies on this that show how political measures can have an impact on trade. Now, another thing that we can see very clearly here is that we don't see any collapse in world trade, not after the COVID-19 crisis. We haven't seen that now as part of the war in the Ukraine. And we also see since 28, it hasn't been going up, but this resilience in the world trade system is something that we have to take note of. Considering all that we hear of the catastrophic developments, I think there's quite a lot of resilience out there. You can see that openness there's a causal relationship, not so much the increase in protectionism that occurs as well, but we can see the lack of new agreements. There's been very little new things happening in terms of liberalization. The world has become more protectionist. That is not being called into question. It's not very easy to measure this. It's not the customs that have increased so much. You can see a large number of different measures, non-tariff measures. In St. Gallen, we have a team working on this. They're trying to determine all of the different laws worldwide. They're trying to check and see if there are any discriminatory elements in them, if they are discriminating against foreign suppliers. Then we would call them trade barriers. And then they just count. well, they just counting apples and pears. Those are things that they're not supposed to do. That's what we tell their students anyway. But the findings are quite meaningful. As you can see, in the last 15 years, 2009, the number of new restrictive measures has increased, and liberalizing measures have existed as well, but certainly not all that very many. Now, what topics are we talking about where we see discrimination? Subventions or subsidies. These are import subsidies, which we see in the textbook. These are not included. They are considered in an extra way. But the non-tariff measures, and then we have things such as export-related measures, for example, subsidies and restrictions. And then the WTO, the World Trade Organization, allows certain countries to pass customs. They have large of imports, and they could do away with all of their companies in the country. Then these measures are allowed by the WTO, and the smallest amount, 10% of the measures, are conventional customs. That's what you usually think of first. These are the things that we consider up until 25% for which the Americans charge for cars. The new kid on the block, these are export restrictions. You can see this in the database. It appeared for the first time in the COVID crisis. In 2020, the commodity prices, raw material prices, went up considerably, and we saw this in many different countries, and export restrictions were issued. A few days ago, India restricted the export for a lot of people who or countries that depended on the import of rice. The export restrictions don't really fit into the world. All of the bureaucrats, etc., they say that exports are good and imports are bad, but exports are an active obstacle. But this prevents the goods from going abroad. If they're kept in the country, then of course this can fight price increases and inflation. So this is important. These are tools that you see more and more during an inflationary phase. So you can see the percentage of these measures, export-related measures or export restrictions, 20% of them are capital controls. This is increasing as well. And I think this whole phenomenon has not come to an end yet. Capital controls, they say that certain investments are not allowed abroad. For example, the export of dual-use technologies, for instance. I'm sure we will hear about that perhaps in the panel. Where does all this come from? Where does the skepticism come from? We see that this phase from 1990 to 2008, we see that there has been clearly, because of the opening up of the world market, China, not only China, but other emerging economies as well, have become more important. And this was not necessarily the intention where China was admitted to the WTO in 2001. So the shift in global market relationships. And also we see the inequalities. There has been an inequality not only with regard to the North, but also in not in countries with lower and medium incomes. Jeffrey Frieden talked about the possibility of not compensating for this in globalization. But I believe that the question of globalization is overweighted, and any mistakes made in the country, they try to make globalization responsible for all of this. And in the history of economists, this has probably existed all around. You always point your finger at the foreigners. And with globalization, we simply blamed all the foreigners with their inputs. They are a threat to our economy, etc. They're responsible for what is not working well. It doesn't mean that globalization has a share in the reason for the inequalities, but these are probably by a factor of 3 or 4 more. Then, of course, we have the environmental problems. Young people, all the activists, this is an important aspect. For example, the Mercosur agreement, they're against that because with more trade with South America, they're afraid that the rainforests will be destroyed. And they're also considering other aspects such as greenhouse gas emissions. That is why people are skeptical with regard to globalization, because we have not been able to put a price on the transport aspect here, or only to a very little extent. A fourth point, and this is one that is also discussed in academia by Danny Roderick, for instance, and that is that they are nation states that we're talking about, also in the overall system, and they are different when it comes to their preferences. The idea of one size fits all. We have a world trade system, an industrial policy, and we have protection of intellectual property. This is supposed to be the same for all countries, but that is something that's hard to ban. And this is something when we see the differences in national interests. In Europe, we see the problem here to try to come up with a common policy for a single market. This is very difficult. In Scandinavia, they have totally other ideas compared to what should happen, for example, in Portugal, for instance. And if we take the global situation, this is even more the case. And if we talk about these different differences with regard to the different preferences, and then we have a one size fits all, and you go to the WTO with that, then there can be resistance to these common rules because this is a question of loss of sovereignty. We can't do what we want to do because the WTO prevents us from doing so. Even if we were allowed to do so, we can't because otherwise our companies will leave our country and things will happen which are so damaging to our economy that we don't assert our own preferences, but we carry out other policies where there may not be a democratic majority. So all this meant that the intellectual basis for all of this, for the global economy, it doesn't have the appeal that it had, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. Free markets, etc., and this will create prosperity and freedom. This is something that has declined and explains the return to protectionism. But one important point, and this is something that's been mentioned already, and I think we'll see it in the panel again, in 2001, that was an important date in November. This is when China joined the WTO. A few years before that, in red, 3 years before, that's where the whole accession process began. We didn't say we're going to go join. It's like when you want to join the EU. You have to prepare this for years, lots of discussions. This was many years beforehand for the economy. China will be joining. Other companies went to China beforehand, and they began to trade with China because they know when they join the WTO, the insecurity or uncertainty was reduced. So in 2001, that's when it happened. And with some delay, we see that China stops to push up its openness. So the de jure and de facto, you can see this phase of preparations, and China opened up. It began much earlier, but then in this phase as well, then right around the major financial crisis, that's when China began to remove itself from the global distribution of labor. We talk about the openness there and the de jure. You can see that things are beginning to oscillate. China is not opening up any further. But at the same time, in this phase, after joining the WTO, China had a real success story. And a lot of people would think that there is a causal relationship. The fact that China has access to the world market, and not only to the consumers in Europe and the US, but also to Western technologies, that's when China began this great convergence. And we assume that a few years ago, I was with a delegation in Washington. It became quite clear that in the United States, our colleagues in the U.S. Trade Representative's office did not expect this to happen. This takeoff on China's part in 2001 was something that was really not predictable. If we had known that, maybe China would not have been admitted to the WTO. Maybe there would have been different conditions for their admittance. But this major upturn for China when it comes to the share of GDP, it was at less than 3% in the 1990s. Imagine that. Germany has 4 or 5%. China was only half as large, economically speaking, as Germany, and their population is 20 times the size of ours, of Germany's. So these are the orders of magnitude that have changed. So you see the upswing of China, and with this share, you can see there was a loss for the West. But again, you wonder why this is the case. Transatlantic cooperation works in the US and Europe. If you count them together, then the situation doesn't look all that bad. But if you look at this major rapid convergence, it was surprising on the part of China, then we can see that there was some political resistance as a result, because this was such a strong and fast opening for such a large company. This meant economic damage. There was the China syndrome, especially in the United States. We saw that the major increase of imports were then also led to a loss of jobs, to more inequality, and of course, major profits elsewhere, and the prices were reduced. I don't know if that was all that bad for the US. I would call that into question, but it led to resistance, especially at a regional level. Then there was another footnote. You can take a look at this guy here, and he's also celebrating an anniversary, Adam Smith, 1976, and his that's the year I was born, just by the way. And Adam Smith, you probably know this. He talked about division of labor and praised this with his needle factory. And he said, this is the source of prosperity. This will not be called into question. This is a major principle of prosperity. And today we still have to talk about bigger than neighbor policies. These are being criticized if you try to get an advantage as a result of customers and the neighbors do exactly the same thing. Then, of course, this leads to a situation where we cause each other problems. But Adam Smith, in his book, he talked about the dependencies that result from the division of labor, and he came up with a justification for this. He said why the navigation acts against the Dutch were legitimate. He said the Great Britain restricted access to the British harbors, and that is a type of policy there. Adam Smith was in favor of the division of labor, and many years later they said that these navigation acts was one of the widest pieces of English commercial legislation. I think that was quite surprising to begin with, but this is understandable considering the discussions that we're now having globally. Now, GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, this is a major pillar in our world trade system. It has an Article 21, which has the national security exemption. And that means that if you are being threatened in terms of your security, then your commitments to the WTO can be reduced. In other words, customs in these negotiations, these were actually excluded. But this is where Adam Smith managed this. So that we've talked a lot about this guy today already, and he made use of Article 21. I believe it was 7 years ago when he talked about steel customs due to a threat to American security. But if you like, although I don't agree that this gentleman read Adam Smith, but there is a correlation here, a causal relationship between these two things. But one thing is clear. In the academic world, first of all, in political science and in economic literature over the last 10 years, things have come up like these books here. We have Robert Blackwood and Jennifer M. Harris, War by Other Means. War by other means, not with tanks, but with customers and technology. Or you have another book, Dan Dresner and Co., The Uses and Abuses of Weaponized Interdependence. In other words, interdependency used as a weapon. And then the IMF talked about the geoeconomic puzzle. Are we in a new phase of geoeconomics? This is not new, I must say. This is the natural state of play. Between 1990 and 2008, we had a different phase, but now this is basically what this is all about. What's exciting here is that this discussion is driven by political scientists and economists. We have thought about power policies as well. This is something that we ignored for decades. It's something where we now have to read up on this from the political scientists, and now we're trying to get insights and put this in our models. But this is very important because what the economists had assumed and continue to assume is that if governments think about trade policy, Then they think, how can they increase the domestic prosperity, the absolute level of it? In political science, in the literature, it's oversimplified a bit. I'm oversimplifying here, but we also have the relative gains theory. In other words, relative trade gains. Not only how you can increase your own prosperity, but how the prosperity can be increased with respect to your rivals. And once you've got that, once it's not only a question of your absolute prosperity, then you can take a look at the lovely models that have been developed will cause you difficulties. Then many of these theories no longer work. These have a problem. Then what we need are the points as well. It's not so important how I am doing, but also how the situation is and what the effect it has on my neighbor. And when both of these come together, economics and political scientists and the logic of the money and the logic of power, if the two of them both play a role, then we have a mixture between a positive sum game. That is what we have from the first part. And we have a zero-sum logic, which results from number two. So a country can only dominate to a relative extent. Now, if that is the case, in other words, political science, zero-sum game, if that's the only one that's important, then our economic logic will no longer work. You can no longer show that the rules of the WTO and GATT would lead to certain proportions. Then you would have to think about these systems in a different way. So it's really important. A problem at GATT and WTO and multilateralism, we have to observe this, and we see that the preferences of the governments have changed. It's not only a question of everyone, each to his own, to be in a better position, but it's also a question now of having our rivals, putting down our rivals. Then I can accept this, as did Trump. I can have the customs against China hurt me, but if they hurt China more than me, then it's okay. This is not very logical for economists. If customs don't do any good, then don't use them. But this is the relative observation that is used here. So what we can see here is that using economic means and customs or tariffs and other instruments economic instruments, but are used to achieve non-economic goals. These can be economic sanctions, and in the last decades, this has increased considerably. You can see this from Global Sanctions database, and this was drawn up together with me and colleagues from the United States. Here we can show to what extent, over the last 10 to 15 years, economic sanctions have increased significantly. Countries are trying to use foreign trade instruments to follow non-trade policies, democracy, or to reestablish human rights, to end a war, Russia against Ukraine, or to fight terrorism, or to settle a territorial conflict, or whatever. In the past, perhaps, military means may have been used, so sanctions are actually progress here. At least we're not losing human lives, at least not at the beginning. The literature shows this as well. These can be very strong means. Sanctions against Iraq. We have literature on that shows how many children, or due to Western sanctions, how many children have died in Iraq. We're not talking about hundreds, we're talking about 200,000 based on a study. So these are lethal weapons. We have trade restrictions. It was almost always a large share of the sanctions were trade sanctions, and now the financial sanctions that are very important now. And we also have restrictions in terms of mobility, travel restrictions. And this shows you to a certain extent how the use of political instruments, and this is for politics, for power, or to try to improve the world. We want to assert human rights worldwide. GATT, that the predecessor organization which regulated world trade after World War II, it was found with 23 original members. It was not a World Trade Organization. It was not until 1995 that we came up with the World Trade Organization, a global framework and an institution, an organization. There are aspects to it. The most preferred nation clause, that is Article 1 in GATT, and in WTO, it was institutionalized. So if I give a preference to a partner, then I have to give this to all of my traders. This is an anti-block building doctrine in WTO and in GATT. And it also requires reciprocity in negotiations. And we also have safety valves and then settling of damages if something terrible goes wrong. No penalties. They often talk about punitive tariffs, but these don't exist. They say, how much damage did this do? What is the economic damage? And this has to be compensated, but it's not by means of a penalty. That's important because with these rules, we can show that this can be used in theory, in other words, how this is the case. And then we have the last 2 points. Okay, so what can we do with regard to the outlook, or what we can say? What can we say? This is an industrialized multilateral system that we are really in a crisis at the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank. How much money can they lend? It's not very much at all. The IMF has received a recapitalization, so other routes can be used to get your financing. And we probably have to get used to the fact that the crisis in these systems will remain in the medium and long term because of the geopolitical tension and the power policies, and this is very important. But of course, there are the 3 Ds. We have demography, decarbonization, and digitalization. They help to reduce costs because the profits that you can get if there is world trade, we can see that this can then be increased. So in the background, the need for institutional and legal contracts is something that is growing because these mega trends are out there. And the second point here, that there are systematic reasons why the situation cannot be that bad. We have a lot of global commons, and we know that certain things can only be settled globally. Climate change is the most important of all. But of course, you can talk of all sorts of other things, the oceans, combating terrorism, etc. And think about what we see here. It's not so much a question of deglobalization, it's a transformation. It includes block building. But behind block building, we have something positive. And this is looking for models which work. A climate club, because we cannot manage a global carbon pricing. Now, at least compared to this is something which can look like a pragmatic solution in order to have a larger degree of implementation. Another thing is clear here. Trade in services. If policies are able to allow that, then of course, if we have technology there to make much more tradable things that up until now have not been tradable, goods that we're talking about are no longer the major driver in the globalization process. So that was basically a view to the empiric situation and some information on research that is being carried out in economics. And we are an interdisciplinary group here today, so maybe it's good for the economists to talk to the political science and the legal experts. So maybe I have a very naive view with regard to the world trade system and globalization over the last few decades. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. But